Hi, welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I am coming at you with some Buzzwordathon recommendations. In case you haven't heard of the Buzzwordathon, it is a yearly book challenge that is put on by Kayla at Books and Lala. And basically, she chooses a different prompt for each month, and they're usually pretty vague, so it's not like they are dependent on any sort of genre or anything like that. But sometimes I think that some of the prompts can be a little bit more difficult, or maybe you need some inspiration. And so I'm sharing some prompts for the month of May, and the prompt for the month of May is flavors. So I have quite a few book recommendations for you in all kinds of different genres. So let's dive in. I also do want to add that I'll have timestamps in the descriptions below, so if there's a particular type of genre that you're interested in, you can look down there and see if any of the genres are kind of your cup of tea or what you're looking for. I also am not choosing any books that are other than the first book of a series. I don't want to choose something that's like in the middle of a series that you couldn't just pick up. So any of these that are parts of series are ones that are the first book, or most of them are actually not parts of series at all. So let's start with some YA recommendations. The first one that I want to recommend to you is The House of Salt and Sorrows. This is actually a fairy tale retelling, but it's a very dark fairy tale retelling. It's based very loosely on the 12 Dancing Princesses. And in this retelling, the main character is, I believe, like fourth or fifth out of her sisters. And her first sister has passed away, and then the second one does, and then the third one does. And she's kind of realizing that though they all appeared to be kind of accidents or natural circumstances, it's beginning to look really suspicious that her sisters are just being picked off one by one. So she's trying to figure out the mystery of why are her sisters dying around her. And it definitely delves a bit into horror territory, but it wasn't too much for me. I'm kind of a horror wimp, and it was still okay for me. So if you're a horror fan, it's probably horror light for you. And if you're not a big fan of horror, maybe it would be too intense for you, but you may be just fine, just like me. But I really enjoyed it. I really like fairy tale retellings anyway, and I just thought it was a lot of fun. The other YA that I'm going to recommend to you is actually historical fiction YA, and that is Salt to the Sea by Ruta Sepetys. This is a historical fiction based on a ship, and I can't remember what the ship's name is. I clearly should have done just a little bit more research before making this video. But in this book, we actually follow 4 different perspectives of 4 young people who end up boarding this ship, and the circumstances that draw the 4 of them together. And a lot of people, for them, this is their favorite, Ruta Sepetys. It's structured differently than a lot of her other books, and so some people like it the best or they like it the least. But I love how Ruta Sepetys takes kind of lesser known historical events and then writes these YA historical fiction surrounding them, because I always learn a ton from her books and get very emotionally attached to the characters. So continuing on the historical fiction train, but in adult historical fiction, is The Hotel at the Corner of Bitter and Sweet by Jamie Ford. And actually, this is one of the few that I'm recommending today that I have not read, but it may actually be the one that I pick up for the Buzzwordathon. It's one I've had for a while and have wanted to pick up. So this, I think, is a dual timeline historical fiction, where the more modern day timeline is in the 80s, and they discover some belongings of some families who were in a Japanese internment camp. And so we're switching back and forth between the Japanese internment camp and then the modern day people, I think, is kind of the premise. And I don't know that much about this book, but I've had it highly recommended to me by several people, and you're really winning if you choose this title, because it actually has 2 flavors, bitter and sweet. So I feel like it counts as 2. So next, let's talk about some mysteries. The first recommendation I have for you is by none other than the Queen of Mystery herself, Agatha Christie, and it's A Pocket Full of Rye. This is a Miss Marple mystery where the deaths that are occurring in this is based off of a nursery rhyme. So there's kind of like these playful hints that are happening, and all of the deaths and the way that the bodies are staged are based around this nursery rhyme, which is a really interesting setting. It's a very fun mystery. I didn't figure out who did it, and I almost never do with Agatha Christie, so this is a really fun one. Another mystery to recommend is Sweetness at the Bottom of the Pie. This is the first in a series of mysteries following Flavia Deluche, who is a young girl who is morbidly obsessed with death and poisons in particular. And so when a mysterious death occurs around her, she's immediately suspicious because of her fascination with those things and decides that she's going to set out and figure out who the murderer is. And even though it does have a younger protagonist, this is not a middle grade book. This is an adult mystery. And Flavia is very precocious and witty, and a lot of people really love this series. This is the only book in the series that I've read, but I think a lot of the subsequent books also have flavors or food related things in them, so you might be able to continue with that. I think one of them has to do with like mustard or something. I don't know. I could be making that up, but Sweetness for sure is in the title of the first book of the series. I also have one contemporary, which is also a translated work, to recommend to you, and that is Sweet Bean Paste. Sweet Bean Paste is fairly unique, I feel like. It's kind of different than a lot of American books that I have read because it's much more based around friendship than it is any sort of romantic relationship, which I really appreciated. It's a very sweet little book about this man who wants to become a chef or a cook, and he ends up getting involved with this elderly woman who has, I believe it's a food stand, or maybe it's a small restaurant, where she makes dorayaki, which are these Japanese pancakes that are filled with sweet bean paste. And she has an amazing recipe, and so he ends up working with her, and then the story goes on from there, and it's a very wonderful book. Another Japanese book that I think probably most people have heard of or have read because it's kind of a booktube darling is Before the Coffee Gets Cold. I just read this last fall and was just blown away by it. I loved it so much. It definitely has some magical realism / sci-fi elements, but it focuses much more relationally than it does on those elements. But the basic premise of the story is that there's this coffee shop where you can actually travel back in time, but there are very strict rules about the time travel. One of which is that you have to sit in a very specific spot in the cafe, and also that they pour out a cup of coffee for you and you have to return to the present timeline before the coffee gets cold. So you have to stay in that seat and drink the coffee. And so it's very interesting, the premise behind it, but it explores different relationships as different people go back. It has, you know, a woman and her significant other. It has two sisters. It has a husband and a wife, and it also has a mother and her child. And so it's kind of almost like these separate stories, but the coffee shop binds all of those stories together, and some of the characters and the stories overlap, especially as you get closer to the end. There's much more relationship happening between those characters, and it is wonderful and made me cry multiple times. Let's move on to some middle grade. I think middle grade was the easiest for me to come up with recommendations for this topic because a lot of middle grade books deal with food or things like that anyway and tend to be more whimsical. So it was a little easier for me to come up with more books for middle grade for this. And I'm going to recommend two by the same author, Roald Dahl, because he has several books that have flavors in them. One of which is James and the Giant Peach, which is about a young orphan boy who ends up inside of this massive peach with these random insects. It's a very interesting tale. It's really weird, but a lot of Roald Dahl books are, I guess. And then the other one, which probably a lot of people could easily think of, is Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And I don't think I need to explain anything about this plot because probably everyone knows about it, even if they've never read the book. You've probably watched one of the movies, either the Gene Wilder one or the Johnny Depp one, or maybe both. And I will say that as is in the case of most times, the book is certainly better than the movies, and especially the Oompa Loompas songs I think are even better. Some of them are translated pretty well, like are much more word perfect, but they don't have like every single thing, I don't think. And I I love this book. It's so wonderful. So I kind of lied to you and told you that I wasn't going to recommend any books in the middle of the series, but I am recommending one. But you don't have to have read previous books in the series to enjoy this, I don't think. And that's On the Banks of Plum Creek by Laura Ingalls Wilder. So many people are very familiar with Laura Ingalls Wilder because of Little House on the Prairie. But On the Banks of Plum Creek is actually my favorite of all of the Little House books. As a child, this was just my favorite. It has a little bit of a different feel, even though we're still following the Ingalls family, but they have just moved to a new location and they are living in a dugout, as you can see maybe in the cover of the book. That Laura is actually running on the top of the house, and there's Ma Ingalls inside doing work, and it's such an interesting setting. And as a kid, I kept hoping that there was some way I was going to end up being able to live in a dugout. And now as an adult, that sounds truly terrible. But as a child, I'm like, oh my goodness, I wonder if dugouts still exist and if I could somehow live in one someday. It was just a really fun setting for this book. The last middle grade that I'm going to recommend is actually one that I have not read, but Claire has read and would highly recommend. I have read other books by this author. It's Cheese by Sarah Weeks. And Sarah Weeks writes a lot of food-related books. So she's written Pie, which I really loved, Honey, which is fun, but I didn't like as much as Pie. Claire said this one is really, really funny, and it's actually 2 books in one, but I think that they follow the same characters. And it is about this young boy who makes kind of these sculptures of cheese, like he bites them into certain shapes, and there's a state on the front. I don't know if that's all that he does. His name is Augie. And it says he's an excellent charver, which is when you chew a piece of cheese to carve it in the shape of something. So Claire said that this book is really funny and it would be a great fit for a book with a flavor in the title. So next I am going to move on to some classics, although I guess the Little House book is a classic, but these are more adult classics. The first one is a bit of a stretch. And it's The Italian by Anne Radcliffe. But when I saw it, I thought of Italian seasoning. So that's a flavor. So Anne Radcliffe wrote some kind of more sensational type novels. In fact, her book, The Mysteries of Udolpho, was one of my favorite books of the year last year and is mentioned by name in Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey as being like a novel that people were just like, so mysterious and so page turning. And so I've actually not yet read The Italian either. It's probably pretty similar in theme, I guess, in terms of it being like exciting and mysterious. And it actually talks about Father Schedoni is enlisted by the imperious Marchesa di Vivaldi to prevent her son from marrying the beautiful Elena. Schedoni has no scruples in kidnapping Elena and undertaking whatever villainy will further his own ends. So this one sounds super fun. I also will recommend The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Huckleberry is a flavor, so it's also his name. This is a book that I do have some mixed feelings on. It kind of is called like the great American novel, but it also has been banned in a lot of places because of the racism and racist language in this book. So if you've not read this book, just know that that is pretty prevalent going in, and I did not enjoy that, but there were aspects of the story that I really did enjoy, and I can see why it gets the praise that it does. Parts of it are so hilarious. Parts of it are really insightful, especially Huck's relationship with the runaway slave that he's with and how he comes to see him as more than just a slave and as more of a person. And so there's a lot of really good themes and good elements about this book, but there's elements about it that make it difficult to read as well, but I can see why it's lauded as a great American novel. And the last classic that I am going to recommend is also, I think, sometimes referred to as the great American novel, maybe not quite as frequently as Huckleberry Finn, but that is The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. I have this lovely like antique first edition that was my grandfather's. So I have to hold it sideways so you can see what book it is because you can't tell from the front. But The Grapes of Wrath is based, I think, in the 1920s or 30s, kind of during Depression era of these families that are traveling to California for work. And we're following the family as they are traveling, and it's definitely dark at times, which is not surprising because it's Steinbeck. And this is one that I really want to reread very soon because I don't think I've reread it since either like end of high school or beginning of college, but I remember really, really loving it. I love Steinbeck's writing so much. There is one more book that I'm going to mention, and it's a nonfiction, and it may be the book that I end up reading for the Buzzwordathon next month, which is why I'm mentioning it. It will probably either be this or The Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, but this might be stretching the prompt a little bit. It is Breaking Bread with the Dead by Alan Jacobs. And is bread really a flavor? It's probably not a flavor. It's a food more than a flavor. So this might be stretching it just a little bit, but this is a book that I've owned for quite a while and I really would love to read. And the subtitle says A Reader's Guide to a More Tranquil Mind, but I know that a big portion of the book and the reason for the title is it's actually talking about reading old books and classics and connecting from them and things that you can learn from them and ways you can connect to the past from older books, which if you've been here for any length of time, you know that I am a huge classics fan. So this is a book that I feel like I'm really gonna love and is going to be very near and dear to my heart whenever I do get to it. Hopefully I'm not hyping it up too much in my mind, but I do have a friend of mine that read this and absolutely loved it. And so I think you could use it. I think you could stretch and make bread work for flavors. So those are my recommendations for the Buzzwordathon, spanning quite a few different genres. I would love to hear from you in the comments down below. Do you have any other recommendations for the prompt of flavor? Because there was plenty of genres that I didn't cover and probably lots of books that I didn't even think of in the genres that I did cover. So if you'd like to leave more suggestions in the comments down below, please feel free to do so because it'll be even more resources for people who might find this video to be able to find more suggestions. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.